Hi, good evening, everyone. First, I want to say that tonight's learning is dedicated for the Refuah Shelema of Binyamin Yisroel ben Chanita. He is in our thoughts and our tefillos, and all of the divrei Torah that we say should be to bring him a Refuah Shelema b'toch shar cholei Yisrael.
Amen.
Again, I apologize. I'm a little not in total sync with the Parsha yet, but there are some important ideas that I want to get out. And I'd like to talk tonight about what do you look for in a marriage, because really it was last week's Parsha, but marriage is a perennial issue that all of us have to deal with. Some of us are single and looking, and others of us are married, but we still need to improve our marriage, to strengthen our marriages, build up our relationships. And I think there are a number of important insights that we can get from the story of Yitzchak and Rivka and their marriage and how their marriage came about. First of all, it's very, very notable how passive Yitzchak was in the choice of his marriage partner. Chazal tell us that because he was an Akedah, because he was sanctified as a korban, he was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. So he cannot go and choose a wife for himself. A wife is chosen for him. And not only that, but even the concept of the shlichut, the agency, Yitzchak didn't make somebody a shaliach to go and find a wife. It was Avram. The father took over everything. Yitzchak's passivity itself is a very, very interesting topic. In many, many ways, it was a function of his holiness. He was kind of removed from the world. And in fact, that actually connects to this week's Parsha. This is part of why Esav was able to deceive him, because Yitzchak was on a type of spiritual madrega where he couldn't understand duplicity, he couldn't understand hypocrisy. If you remember, the sages tell us that Esav would ask all sorts of super frum questions. How do you take the tithing? How do you take the truma and the maser from straw or from salt? Which of course you don't have to do, but Esav gave the impression of a super machmir person. And perhaps someone like Rivka could see through that, because after all, Rivka was raised in a house of liars and deceivers, so she knew when she saw it. Yitzchak was kind of above it. And in fact, the Netziv even says, this sounds almost like a modern pop psychology idea, but the Netziv actually says it, that the reason why Rivka had to do a deception in order for Yaakov to make the bracha, why couldn't she just tell Yitzchak directly, is that the relationship between Yitzchak and Rivka was a little different, maybe very different, than the relationship between Sarah and Avraham. Sarah and Avraham, you had a sense of kind of a virtual equality in their relationship. When Sarah had a problem, she confronted Avraham. She says, you got to get rid of Yishmael, he's a bad influence. And when Avraham was in doubt as to what to do, God told Avraham very straightforwardly, Kol asher tomar Sarah, whatever Sarah says, listen to her. She knows what she's talking about. And Chazal tell us, Avraham worked in Kiruv, in outreach, to bring people to Hashem. Avraham worked with the men, and Sarah worked with the women. This is the nefesh, the souls that they made, all the way back in Haran, before they even came to the land of Israel. So when you look at Avram and Sarah, you actually see a team, kind of a team of equals. Each one had their views, and there was a very free exchange of views. The Netziv says, and again I say this sounds a little pop psychology, but he actually says it, that the relationship of Rivka and Yitzchak was very different. Rivka was in awe of Yitzchak. Rivka felt she was not always able to totally discuss things with Yitzchak as an equal, and there are two reasons for this. One reason is the age discrepancy. Remember, Chazal have a Masorah. You may consider this believable or not, that Rivka was only 3 years old, and Yitzchak was 40 years old, a 37-year difference. And even like the alternative view in Chazal, that Rivka was 14, there was still a very significant age difference. Of course, Avram and Sarah were 10 years apart, but that's not the same as 37 years apart. And second of all, Yitzchak had a certain otherworldly quality to him. Yitzchak was so removed from the world that Rivka had a sense of awe. and therefore she could espouse her position only by indirection, only by hinting, only by subterfuge. Indeed, because Yitzchak was above everything. So you actually see already two different kind of models in marriage. Again, you have kind of the equal, the team, and then you have kind of the sense of awe and reverence, depending, of course, most of us are not on the madrega to command the awe and reverence aspect of it. But it is interesting that you see a different family dynamic here, which can result in some problems, because obviously, just on the most basic level, the communication between Yitzchak and Rivka was not as optimal as perhaps it could have been. But okay, but I want to go backwards a little bit, and I want to talk about the shidduch. So the first point is, of course, the passivity. But there's a second point that the Gemara in Chulin talks about, and that is the verbosity of the account of the whole story. Because you'll recall the way it's written in the Parsha is things are happening, and then when Eliezer tells Besuel, who is Rivka's father, and then Lavan, Rivka's brother, he tells them the whole story over again. Now the Torah is normally very economical with words. The Torah will often say, and he said everything that happened. He doesn't have to go over. If you're given a narrative structure, A through Z happened. And then it says, and the servant told the family what happened. It's not going to repeat A to Z again. The Torah is very economical. There are many, many halachot that we derive from a single verse, from a single word, and sometimes even from a single letter. The Torah has great economy of expression. If an idea could be conveyed in one word, it's not going to be conveyed in two words. And in fact, if it is conveyed in two words, we're going to ask the question, why say two words if one word would have been enough? So why is there so much repetition here? The story happens, and Eliezer then says the exact, not the exact story, but all of the details of the story again. Why does the Torah bother to have that verbosity? So the Gemara itself gives a relatively straightforward answer. And the Gemara says in Chulin, Yafa sichasan shel avdei avos, even the casual conversation of even the slaves of the patriarchs is more beloved than God, more beloved to God than all of the Torah that was later given to the children. Meaning God so much cherishes everything that is connected to the lives of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that he will go into great and repetitive detail to elaborate, to go over, to chazer, to review, even though with respect to us, the whole Torah's whole laws are given in a very great economy of expression. So the Gemara simply answers that the repetition is due to chavivos, right? Something that you love, someone that you like, or that you love. You kind of, you want to spend time with. You repeat, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. You say it over and over and over again, and you don't say, like a lamdan, oh, why did you have to say you love me the second time? You already said it the first time. That's not the way love works. Love works with an abundance of language, and the abundance of language, the Gemara in Chulin says, is an example of divine love. But here is the thing, and this is a very important general tool in understanding Chumash, actually Tanakh. When the Torah repeats narratives, it never repeats the narrative in the identical way. This is what is critical. Meaning you don't simply say, oh, why is there a repetition? In every repetition, there will be redundancies, there will be omissions, there may be contradictions, there may be different ways of saying the same thing, stylistic variation. And stylistic variation isn't just a matter of poetic expression. I want to sound nice by varying my expression. If a different expression is used, there's a reason. The great commentator, the Abarbanel, Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, again, his life was so colorful, it's worth a minute just to talk about him. Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, called Don Yitzchak Breitowitz because he was actually of the Spanish nobility, was the finance minister of Spain during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. In fact, he was involved in financing the expedition of Columbus. to the New World. And of course, during his tenure was when we had the Great Inquisition against the Jews, culminating in the expulsion of the Jews who didn't want to convert to Christianity. Some of them converted externally, and they remained practicing Jews in private. And they were called, although it's a derogatory term, Marranos. Marranos actually means pigs, but they were called Marranos. We call them today the Anusim, those who were forced. Others were burnt at the stake, and still others were expelled. There's a tradition that this happened on the 9th of Av, although historically that's very, very tenuous, but nevertheless, 1492 was the year of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And because the Abarbanel was so needed by Ferdinand and Isabella, he was given the opportunity to remain in Spain as an observant Jew. He would have been the only openly observant Jew in Spain. But he refused. He basically said, if my people are leaving, then I will go with them. So he actually left that very, very prestigious government position. And he was at the head of the procession of the Jews that were leaving Spain. Interestingly enough, a little bit of detail, the Abarbanel was in his 70s at the time, and he was at the head of the procession. At the edge of the procession, there was a mother with a young 4-year-old child. That 4-year-old child was Rav Yosef Karo. He grew up to be Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who first went to Turkey, Constantinople, and then found his way to Eretz Yisrael, to Tzfat, and of course he was the great Rav of Tzfat, and one of the greatest poskim we've had, the definitive posek, the one who authored the Shulchan Aruch. There is a tradition, again, these are traditions, I'm not sure if they're historically accurate, that the Abarbanel was leading the procession on the 9th of Av, and he ordered that they play music as they were leaving. And there's a machlokes as to what's going on. How are you allowed to play music on the 9th of Av? We don't even do it from Rosh Chodesh Av. So I'll give you two pshatim. There are actually two explanations why. One was that people were so devastated, they were so heartbroken, that he felt it was almost a matter of life and death. That sometimes there are extraordinary situations where you have to cheer people up, or they're not going to be able to go on. Even today, I mean, you have to ask a Rav. But if somebody is suffering from severe depression or anxiety, so even on the 9th of Av, we might tell a person, depending on the situation, in private, do what you need to do. That's pshat number one. But I saw a pshat number two that I thought was very fascinating. The Abarbanel was actually making the point that when you're kicked out of Galus, there's nothing to cry about. We cry when we were taken from Eretz Yisrael. Huh? You're kicked out of Spain? All right, you were in Galus, now you're in Galus. What's the problem? Meaning, don't look, in other words, you're looking at Spain as if we're leaving our home. It's not your home. It's a very interesting point. It's not your home. And therefore, nothing to cry about. So an interesting idea that a Jew should not be so attached to Chutz La'aretz to ever regard it as his home. In fact, the Shalah HaKadosh, Rabbi Yishaya Horowitz, who lived in the 1500s, the generation after, and he was a very, very prominent Rav in Frankfurt. He was actually quite well off, and he left everything to come to Yerushalayim, and he wrote the Sefer Shnei Luchot Habrit, which is a virtual encyclopedia of Kabbalah and Halacha. It's hard to even find anything there because it is such a vast and rich Sefer. That's why he's called Shalah. Shalah is an abbreviation. So he writes, he was very critical of Jews who build big houses in the Golah. Houses that will last hundreds of years, stone houses, brick houses. He says a Jew should never look at his place in the Golah as something permanent. Rabbi Berel Wein tells a story. Rabbi Berel Wein has a yeshiva that he founded in Monsey. So when he was building the yeshiva, I guess maybe 30, 35, 40 years ago, so one of his supporters offered him special wood from Finland that doesn't warp for 200 years. I guess average wood tends to warp after 50 years. There's a certain structural problem. This wood would last 300 years. And Rabbi Wein said he didn't want to take it because he was not going to deliberately build a yeshiva in Chutz La'aretz that would last 300 years. That would have been a statement. Now, I have a kasha on Rabbi Wein, or at least an alternative explanation, because the Gemara in Megillah tells us that all of the shuls in Chutz La'aretz are going to be uprooted and relocated in Eretz Yisrael. So Mamela, I would have said to Rabbi Wein, build your yeshiva with the Finland timber, and you're not making a statement that it's going to be in Chutz La'aretz, because your yeshiva is going to be uprooted and it's going to come to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, be it as it may. Going back to the Abarbanel, which I'll then go back to the main subject. The Abarbanel, however, is best known not for the fact that he was finance minister of Spain, but he's known for his great, great commentaries on the Chumash and on the Nevi'im. He did not write on the Kesuvim except for Sefer Daniel, because the Abarbanel was one of the great, great writers about Mashiach. And the book of Daniel has many messianic calculations, which are very obscure. So the Abarbanel did write actually more than one parish on Daniel, but he did not write, as far as I know, on the other Ketuvim. But he did write on the Chumash, and he did write on the Nevi'im. And the Abarbanel is a very lengthy parish, which is really too bad in some ways, because there's a lot of tremendously beautiful, good things in the Abarbanel, but sometimes it's a little long. That's why you'll find today, even in English, there are abridgments, condensations, adaptations, as it were, to bring the Abarbanel to the general public. The Abarbanel's style is an interesting style. He prefaces each chapter or each paragraph of the Chumash, or not Nevi'im, with many, many questions. He may ask as many as 100 questions, and then give an explanation that will answer all of those questions. So there's an old joke about a person who became an apikoros because he studied the Abarbanel, because he used to read the Abarbanel's commentary after eating cholent Shabbos afternoon. So he's sitting in his chair and he's reading 100 problems with the Chumash. Then he falls asleep. He becomes an apikoros. He says, how can I believe in a book that has so many questions, so many difficulties, so many contradictions? So he never got to the answers. So it's a little dangerous to have a lot of questions without giving any type of answer. Okay, but be it as it may, the reason I'm bringing this up is the Abarbanel pays very, very careful attention to the different recountings of the story, and he points out no fewer than 50 differences between the account as it happened and the account as Eliezer recounted it. Now, I'm not going to go over 50. I'm only going to over 3 or 4, and to show how important it is. So this is going to be important both for marriage, and it's important. It's an important key to Chumash, that when you look at Chumash, pay a lot of attention to repetitive stories, because repetitive stories will often be very, very significant in terms of the differences in the repetitions. They're never going to be exactly the same. So here, let's go back to the story. The story begins with Avraham calling his servant to him and making his servant swear that he will not take a wife for Yitzchak from the Canaanite women, but he will go El Artzi v'el Moladati, to my land and to my place of birth. Now note that Avraham did not specifically say, go to my family. For reasons that you'll see a little later, Avraham's emphasis was on geography. It was not on family. Artzi umoladati. Again, I'm translating moladati as place of birth. Now, some say moladati means family of birth, but if you say moladati is place of birth, Avraham's hakpada was not about family at all. Avraham's hakpada was about taking a woman from a certain geographical area. When Eliezer is recounting the story to Besuel and Lavan, he says, my master made me swear that I would go el beis avi umishpachti. I will go to my father. Avram said, I will go to his father's home and his family. So Eliezer made a switch here. Eliezer switched the definition of the mission from geography to family. Is there a significance in that switch? Okay, that's issue number one. Issue number two. Eliezer brings up a question. Perhaps the woman will not want to go. Shall I bring your son there? if the woman doesn't want to go. So Avraham said, Chas v'shalom, under no possible circumstances shall you take my son out of Eretz Yisrael. In such a situation, you are absolved of your oath, and we can take some Canaanite people, particularly Oner, Eshkol, and Mamre, who are Avraham's close confederates. Now, when Eliezer is telling that story to Laban, he raises the question, I asked my master, what if the woman doesn't want to go? And Eliezer simply says, and my master said, don't worry about it, God will give you success. He doesn't mention, under no circumstances shall my son be taken there. Eliezer omits that detail. He changes it into an assurance, Hashem will give you success. Third, Eliezer devises a test. Now, this test is clearly not superstition. It's not like saying, for example, the first woman that's wearing a yellow dress is going to be the right wife. That would be superstition. That would be forbidden. Eliezer's test is not based on superstition. Eliezer's test is based on character. It's based on midot. It's based on kindness. And we'll see, how did Eliezer know to look for that? Well, we'll come to that. Eliezer wants to find a woman who is kind and considerate and compassionate. So he devises a test. I'm going to ask a woman for, give me and my camels and my animals to drink, and the woman that does that is the right woman. Now, did Rivka do exactly what Eliezer proposed? She actually did not, but she did better. Eliezer's proposal was, she will give me and my camels to drink. Meaning, she'll give the water and say, give this to you, drink it, and give it to your camels. Rivka didn't do that. Rivka gave the water to Eliezer and said, drink up. And only after he finished drinking, she then said, I will go back and draw more water for your camels. See the difference? Eliezer's original proposal was, she will give me and the camels. Rivka did better, and Rivka did better in actually two different ways. First of all, Rivka did better because when you tell a person, this is both for you and your animals, the person might be reluctant to drink everything they need to drink because they know they have to save something for the camels. Rivka, on the other hand, said, drink up, drink up, drink up. Don't worry about it. And then she went back. So Eliezer would not be inhibited. Number two, when you say to somebody, this is for you and your camels, there's a certain denigration of human dignity because you're saying, yeah, you and your camels, you're the same. This way, you drink. After you drink, I'll give your camels. Now, most of them before them do ask a kasha. According to halacha, you're supposed to feed the animals first. How could Rivka give him first? How could Eliezer take first? Okay, the Magen Avraham learns from there that only applies to eating, not drinking. Because drinking, a person, God forbid, could die of thirst or whatever it will be. And number three, look at the fact that she went to the trouble of going back to the well a second time. Right? Because when she says, drink up and then I'll go back, she's talking about a second trip. So, did she do, it was like she did extra credit, meaning, did she do 100% of what Eliezer stipulated? She did not, but she did 120% of what Eliezer stipulated. And since his test was not based on superstition, his test was based on character. When a test is based on character, so of course, the better you do, the better it is. But when Eliezer tells the story to Lavan, Eliezer makes it a one-to-one correspondence. I said, the woman that will give me and my camels is the right woman, and behold, Rivka gave it to me and to my camels. In other words, he makes the correspondence exact, even though the correspondence was not exact. He doesn't emphasize the difference in what she did. Another problem. After Rivka passed the test, Eliezer immediately gives her the jewelry. Jewelry in gold. And then he asks her, oh, by the way, Bas Miat, you are the daughter of whom? Meaning, when he gave her the jewelry, he didn't know who she was. When he recounts the story to Lavan, he says, after this woman passed the test, I said, Basmiat, who's your father? Of course, it was Avraham's nephew. Her father was Avraham's nephew, because Besuel is the son of Nachor. Nachor is Avraham's brother, who's no longer alive. Rashi explains, why did Eliezer change the order? Because Eliezer wanted to be logical. If Eliezer would have said, I gave her the jewelry first, and then I asked Basmiat, they would have said, well, how could you give her the jewelry until you knew she was our family? So Eliezer changed it to make it a sensible story. But if that's what makes it a sensible story, then why didn't Eliezer do the sensible thing? Okay? Now, a final observation is not about discrepancy, but it's about something that we sometimes don't even notice. I think I mentioned before Nechama Leibowitz's famous observation that there are some midrashim that are so well known and beloved to us that we literally are sure it's in the Chumash, even though it's not in the Chumash. Like our minds literally read it into the text. The example we talked about was Avram being thrown in the fiery furnace, if you remember, and being saved. That is not in the Chumash. Well, it's interesting. I've probably said 25 or 30 times in the course of a half an hour, Eliezer, Eliezer, Eliezer. Show me in the Chumash where it says Eliezer was the one who was sent to find a wife for Yitzchak. It doesn't say. Meaning, we know from other places Eliezer was Avram's servant, but Avram had other servants as well. And throughout the narrative, the man that is effecting this marriage is not described as Eliezer. His name is not mentioned once. He is described only as Eved Avraham. He is anonymous. It's as if he doesn't have a name. It's as if he doesn't have an identity. Why is that so? So you see, with these discrepancies and the unusual fact that Eliezer is not mentioned by name, although he is mentioned by name in other parts of the Chumash as well. So let's start off to understand the meaning of these discrepancies, these anomalies. Let me start with a very beautiful observation from the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim, one of the great Rishonim. The Ran is known primarily as a master of halacha. The Ran wrote commentaries on the Rif and on the Gemara that are still in the yeshivos, are still learned. But the Ran wrote another very, very interesting sefer on Jewish philosophy and explanation of major themes in the Torah, which is called the Dreshasharan. Recently, I think ArtScroll published a translation of the Dreshasharan. There's an earlier translation from Rav Shraga Silverstein, Zichrono Livracha, in which I actually wrote an introduction to it, so you can get either version is good. But the Dreshasharan is really one of the major philosophical works of the Middle Ages. And the Dreshasharan points out the following idea. Chazal tell us, and Rashi brings this, that Eliezer himself had a daughter. And Eliezer himself was hoping that perhaps Avraham would choose Eliezer's daughter to be a wife for Yitzchak. After all, Eliezer is righteous. Eliezer is Avraham's faithful servant. Eliezer is Avraham's greatest Talmud. And yet Avraham rejects Eliezer in favor of Avraham's own either family or city, depending on it, even though the people there were idol worshippers. Ovdei Avodah Zarah? What's going on here? Is this pure racism? My family is better, even if they're idol worshippers, than a person who's a tzaddik and righteous and learned? So the Ran says quite an amazing idea. The Ran says, certainly Eliezer was righteous. Certainly Eliezer was worthy. But Eliezer was a Canaanite. And the one thing about the Canaanites was they had a natural propensity to cruelty and a lack of compassion. Now, obviously, we don't assume Eliezer was cruel. Eliezer worked on himself. But inside his nature, because this was the nature of the Canaanites, was a cruelty. Avraham knew that in Haran, the people of Haran were kind. They were good. So here's what the Ran says. If a person is an idol worshiper, a person is not religious, that's kind of an educational deficit. I didn't learn true beliefs. I didn't learn a way of life. That's correctable. You take somebody who simply doesn't know what the world is about, doesn't know about Hashem, and you teach them about Hashem, and you can bring them to a good place. But when there's a character flaw, cruelty, that is much, much harder to change. And even if it changes through hard work, it may re-emerge in a later generation. And therefore, it's an amazing thing. Avraham rejected Eliezer because there was a pagam, a defect in kindness. And that explains an obvious question. How did Eliezer know to devise this particular test? Who told him to devise the test? Avram didn't say what to look for. But you see, the fact that Eliezer was excluded was because of a lack of chesed. Therefore, Eliezer understood exactly what he had to do. Now, this itself is an amazingly relevant lesson, because it really tells us, what do we look for in a marriage? What do we look for in a shidduch? Right? Do we look for a black hat in the case of a man, or whatever equivalent to a black hat would be in the case of a woman? Are we looking for super frumkeit? My wife is so machmer that, she will take, trumas and meiser from even what you buy from the badats. Which, by the way, is not in a rational position. Some people do that. And again, I got to it. I don't mean to demean that aspect of life. But the Ran is saying, look what the Ran is saying. The Ran is saying, better to take a person from a family of idol worshippers who has kindness and generosity in her heart than to take the most religious, God-fearing person who has a streak of cruelty. You look for chesed. You look for kindness. Now again, lahalacha lamaisa, you have to ask a Rav. If somebody were to tell me, if one of my students were to tell me, oh, I met the most wonderful woman, a heart of gold, it happens to be she's Jews for Jesus, but okay, okay, listen, you got to talk about that. Obviously, I wouldn't approve that particular shidduch. But just in terms of priority, assuming that your shidduch is a basic commitment to mitzvahs, the kindness and the chesed is going to be more important than many other elements. An amazing thing. And in this way, by the way, you need to see the greatness of Eliezer. This must have hurt Eliezer tremendously. This must have hurt him. And Eliezer actually had every incentive for the mission to fail. Because if the mission were to fail, Eliezer might be next in line. Because remember, Abraham said, the oath will be annulled. And yet, Abraham had confidence that Eliezer will carry out the job. And we're going to see Eliezer not only carried out the job, but he did more than he had to do. And you'll see this in a moment. And that is why Eliezer's name is not mentioned. Because Eliezer totally obliterated his ego, his self-interest, his agenda. He ceased to exist as an independent person with his own dreams and his own desires. That's how faithful he was to Avram and his teaching. That's a very, very high madrega indeed. The madrega of being mevatel yourself, nullifying yourself to what your master wants. And again, what Avram wants is a reflection of what Hashem wants. So really, it was mevatel himself to the ratzon habore, because Avram was a navi. And that's very, very difficult. Pirkei Avos talks about nullifying your will to the will of God, and then God will do what you need. So now, with this understanding, we can explain all of the discrepancies. Number one, Eliezer had every incentive personally to sabotage the mission, and he didn't. But number two, not only did he not sabotage the mission, but he deliberately did more than he had to do in order to maximize its success. And this explains the shinuyim in what he said and what happened when it happened. Avraham, as I said initially, did not care about family. Avraham just said, go to my city, go to my place of birth. Why didn't Avraham care about family? Because based on the Ran, Avraham is basically telling Eliezer, go to Haran because they're Balei Chesed. Doesn't have to be my family. In Haran, they are Balei Chesed. But Eliezer understands that he has a big job ahead of him. He has to flatter up, he has to butter up the family and make them realize how important they are, because otherwise they would never consent to let young Rivka go. So what does he have to do? To butter up, if he would just say, oh, my master said I should show up in Haran and pick a girl from the street. That's not very impressive. He has to say, the great Avram, who is rich, prosperous, famous, sent me all the way here because he was looking for you. You're special. You're a family that he wants to be reconnected to. In other words, if Eliezer would have just said, oh, Avraham told me, come to this land and find a woman, that would not have appealed to their ego. Right? And now Eliezer could have done that because that's exactly what happened. But he was Mishaneh. He changed the story a little bit to maximize success. The second issue I raised was when Avraham said, God forbid, if the woman doesn't want to go, do not under any circumstances take my son there. So you'll remember, Eliezer doesn't say that part to Lavan. Very simple. If I want to impress you, I want you to think how important you are. I'm not going to tell you, by the way, my master said that his son will never ever set foot in your house under any circumstances. That would be perceived as an insult. Eliezer leaves it out. The test. The test, you'll remember, was not 100%, because Eliezer's test was, she's going to offer me and the camels. And instead, what Rivka did was, she first gave him, and then for the camels. From Eliezer's perspective, that's even better. But Eliezer is using the test for a different purpose. Eliezer is doing two strategies. One is flattering them, and the other is appealing to their superstitious belief in omens. Remember, Lavan and Besuel were pagans. And pagans very much connect to superstition, to omens, and the like. Eliezer wants to communicate to them, you see that God, or the gods, small g, want this shidduch because of the sign of I proposed the test and Rivka passed it. Now, the difference between an omen and a test of midos, a test of character, is an omen is an omen only if there's a 100% correspondence. If Eliezer would have said, oh, I said the woman that offers me and the camels, and Rivka offered me, and after I drunk, she went back to the camels. Lavan would have said, that's not an omen. It didn't happen exactly the way you say. Close is not good enough. So from Eliezer's perspective, which is a character test, it's even better. But from the superstitious omen perspective, that wouldn't be good enough. So Eliezer has to make it a closer correspondence than it otherwise would be. The sequence. As soon as the woman passed the test, Eliezer gave her the jewelry. And then he asked, by the way, who's your father? From Eliezer's perspective, that was totally logical. Because Eliezer wasn't looking for a member of the family. He was looking for a person from Haran that had chesed. As far as Eliezer is concerned, as soon as she showed that midah, that was enough. But here is the thing. One of the skills that we learn as a little child, maybe it's something we shouldn't learn, is that whenever you lie, you got to be sure to be consistent and change every part of your story. If you're changing part of your story, you got to be sure to change the other part of the story. Now, here is the thing. Eliezer changed the mission from geography to family. But once he changed it to family, he couldn't say, I gave her the jewelry first, and then I asked who was her family. Because if you didn't know who her family was, you couldn't have married her. You see, Shelema, based on the original mission, when Avraham said, go to the place and find a suitable person. So Eliezer could have given, and did give her the jewelry before asking the family, because family didn't make a difference. But once he changed it from geography to family, he had to also change the sequence. I asked her who she was, and then I gave her the jewelry. Right? So this explains all of the differences. What Eliezer is essentially doing is, he is lying. He is lying, yeah? And you might say, oh, lying is no good. Okay, that's all other, right? The whole union of lying we have in this Parsha as well. But the idea was that, number one, to extricate a righteous woman from a house of avodah zarah. You know, there's a mitzvah to lie to get her out, to bring her to the shidduch with Yitzchak. So there are cases, again, one is not supposed to lie, and again, one of the unfortunate attributes sometimes of religious societies is people are over lenient in lying to the government or filing false claims or insurance. I know people are always cutting corners, and this is wrong. One is supposed to be honest, one is supposed to be truthful. You are supposed to be truthful not only to other religious Jews, which is obvious, but certainly even to non-religious Jews and even to non-Jews. So whether it's the government, whether it's non-Jewish people, whether it's non-religious Jews, whether it's religious Jews, a Jew is supposed to be honest. The very first question we're going to be asked after we die is, did we conduct our business affairs with honesty and integrity? That's question number one. Did you learn Torah on a regular basis? That's question number two. So the very first question is honesty. So obviously I'm very in favor of honesty. It's a very, very important value. But there are times, I think everybody would agree, when it's permissible to lie, right? If a terrorist asks you, where are the kids? You know, give me the directions to the kindergarten. You know, you kind of steer him away, right? If he's asking you those questions, and the like. So it's a halachic issue, but suffice it to say that under the circumstances of extricating Rivka from a corrupt and degenerate environment, Eliezer was allowed to do what he was allowed to do. But the issue is, why did he do it? He would have every motivation to have this mission fail. And if he would have said things exactly the way they unfolded, there would be no taina against him, because he told the truth. So he went the extra mile to maximize the success of the mission, because had he said it over the way it happened, there would have been less of a chance that the mission would be successful. So you see a tremendous, tremendous lesson in faithfulness. But going back to the major point of the Ran, and I think the Ran is our foundation point here, the Ran says the single most important quality that one looks for in a marriage partner is the kindness, compassion, and caring. Okay, very, very important. And this is true. Now, in this context, of course, it is what the man is looking for in the woman, but the commentaries say it is equally true that a woman should seek this in her husband, in a man as well. You know, it's interesting that the Torah says by the creation of Chava that it is not good for man to be alone. Lo tov. It is not good for Adam to be alone. I will make a helpmate to be opposite him. And the question is, when was this said? This was said in the Garden of Eden, and this was said before the sin. Remember, there was no sin until Chava came in and ate the fruit. So what is so bad with man being alone in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden has all of the delights. He could have anything he wants except for one tree, okay? But everything else is his. He doesn't have to worry about laundry. He doesn't need clothing, etc. He has a whole world that belongs to him. That's for his appropriation. What is so bad to be alone in a world of infinite pleasures? And the commentaries say that God is described as the ultimate good. And the reason God is described as the ultimate good is because God gives and God does not take. Because there's nothing that you can give to God. So goodness, emulating Hashem, is when we become a giver more than a taker. So when it says it's not good for man to be alone, you can translate it slightly differently. Man cannot be in a state of goodness when they are alone, because man in the Garden of Eden has an infinite capacity to take from the world. But man has no one to whom to give. And without giving, he cannot be godly. And without giving, he cannot be good, because good equals Hashem. In fact, some say, B'derech Drush, it only fits the English name, the Dead Sea. Why is the Dead Sea called the Dead Sea? Of course, in Hebrew, it's not called the Dead Sea, it's called Yam HaMelech. So this is a drash based on the English. It's called the Dead Sea because it only takes and it doesn't give, meaning all the water that flows into the Dead Sea doesn't go anywhere else. The Dead Sea is a dead end. So the concept is, if all you do is take and you don't give, you're dead. Being alive means giving, sharing. So the Torah writes that Hashem created marriage to enable us to be more godly by becoming givers rather than takers. You remember, of course, John F. Kennedy's famous inaugural address from the 1960s. Most of you were not born then, but ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Marriage is the same thing. Ask not what your marriage does for you, ask what you can do for your marriage. Again, the whole purpose of the creation of man and woman is that we should become more godly by learning to go beyond our egotism and our selfishness. Because once we open our heart beyond our selfishness, there's room for Hashem to come in. When we're closed because of our selfishness, then there's no Hashem. Now, there is a certain subtlety here. There is absolutely a subtlety here. And the subtlety is that in order to be a giver, you have to be a taker. I mean, imagine a situation where a guy hears this Musar Shmuz and says, "You're right, the purpose of marriage is to be a giver. I'm going to give. And every time his wife wants to do something for him, he says, "I give, I don't take." How is she going to feel? She's going to feel demeaned. She's going to feel that she has nothing to contribute. She's going to feel that she's just a recipient of charity, which is itself, right? So the subtlety here is that when you give to another person, one of the deepest ways you give to another person is to have that other person understand how much you need them to give to you. A person who only gives and doesn't take is actually selfish and egotistical in a different way. You can be selfish because you're always taking, or you could be selfish because you always need the ego satisfaction, that I'm the big tzaddik who's always giving. So the subtlety of married life is that to be truly a giving person, I open myself up to what the other has to give to me. I'm willing to be vulnerable. I'm willing to be weak. I'm willing to say that there are things that I need from you. And that makes a person feel needed. And that makes a person feel wanted. And therefore, this is the minuet, so to speak, that to be a true giver, you also have to know how to take, and when to take, and be open to take, because then you're giving a great gift. You're giving the gift of self-validation, legitimation to the other person. So that's a very, very important idea. Since we are talking about marriage, again, I'm going to mazel tov to Chassan that's here in the back, just got married on Sunday, Moshe Nachum. And so there are no accidents. I didn't know you would be here, but it happens we were talking about marriage, so Baruch Hashem, I'm glad I'm able to get this in. Let me just mention the rest of the pasuk, going back to Bereshis. Lo tov heyos adam levado. It is not good for man to be alone. Okay, we talked about that. I will make a helpmate to be opposite. So what is the lashon? I'll make a helpmate to be opposite. Opposite implies opposition. So the Gemara gives a pragmatic answer. If you're fortunate, you'll have a helpmate. If not, you'll have opposition. It's this or that. But the Sfas Emes gives a deeper explanation. The Sfas Emes says that the true helpmate in marriage is the opposition, meaning to say like this. All of us would like kind of a clone of ourselves in which I would like my spouse to agree with me every single time. But the question becomes, if all I have is a duplicate of myself in a different gender, how will I grow? How will I ever become a better person? So the truth of the matter is, God B'dafka made men and women with different personalities, different ways of looking at the world, so that each person can become greater by developing qualities within themselves that would otherwise be dormant. That's why, for example, Avram, who represents loving kindness, Sarah was much more disciplinarian, and she understood when things had to be done. And through the interaction of Avram and Sarah, Sarah developed greater kindness than she would have had, and Avram developed greater discipline. Yitzchak and Rivka. Yitzchak in many ways was like his mother. He was inward, focused. Rivka was like his father, Avram. You have to have a harmony, a balance. Now you have to be careful. The idea that each one, right, so if an extrovert marries an introvert, the extrovert becomes more reflective because of the introvert. And the introvert becomes better able to relate to people. Each one develops from their interaction with the other a quality that they otherwise would be lacking. The harmony, the balance. So people say opposites attract. That's not totally true. If two people are absolutely opposites, it may not work. But it is good to look for someone that has certain aspects that are deficient in your own personality, because then it gives you the opportunity to grow and become someone that would be greater than you otherwise would be. Now you have to be careful that each one doesn't pick up the negative attributes. They tell a story with George Bernard Shaw and Isadora Duncan, who was a very, very famous ballet dancer, and she's a little bit of a flirtatious person. So she once said to Shaw at a party, Mr. Shaw, with my looks and your brains, we'll have wonderful children together. So Shaw, who is known as a curmudgeon, said to her, that's true, but what if the kids have your brains and my looks? Then we're going to be in big trouble. So it could happen, it could happen that each one learns from the other the thing that you're not supposed to pick up. Okay? But that's not the hope. The hope and the aspiration is that kenegdo, bedafka, in the ways that we're different, is where you get growth. You see things in a different way, a new way, a deeper way, a different pair of glasses, and different midot that would be dormant come out. And that's why Ezer Kenegdo is not a contradiction. It's precisely in the opposition, the differential personalities, that goodness emerges. This is what you might call, in politics there used to be a phrase, I think there probably is still a phrase, although both in Israel and in the United States it's largely dead, called the loyal opposition. There was a concept primarily emerging from British politics, that even if you were in the opposition, you were fundamentally loyal to the good of the country. And marriage is the same way, that there is loyalty, there is love, there is connection, But that doesn't mean there's not going to be opposition, meaning there's going to be different ways of looking at things. And that actually is healthy and positive, and that brings people to a better place than they otherwise would be. So, Be'ezrat Hashem, we should take these lessons to heart, and may HaKadosh Baruch Hu bless all of those who need to find their shidduch, to find a shidduch with the proper midot, and all of us who are married, we should be zocheh to work on our marriages, strengthen our marriages, to understand, as our sages tell us, we talked about this a few weeks ago, ish v'isha, when a man and a woman are together in proper shalom, shechina shiruya beinehem, the presence of God is with them. May we be zocheh to make our homes a residence and an abode for the divine presence.